Today I'm joined by Maya Dukmasova, who's a senior writer at the Chicago Reader. She covers policing, housing, the courts, and local social justice movements. Maya, it's great to speak to you today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, there are so many conversations over the last 4 or 5 months that relate to policing in the United States. We've had the George Floyd protests, we've had sort of more political conflicts between local, state, and federal law enforcement as we saw federal troops deployed to certain cities around the United States. One of the things that is sort of underlying a lot of these conversations are the issues of police unions as well as police immunity in certain situations. And it's interesting, maybe as a place to start the conversation, to think about a lot of people who tend to be in favor of democratization of workplaces and in favor of unions and collective bargaining have identified that police unions are a little bit different, that it's not exactly the same when you're talking about a union maybe of delivery drivers and a union for police officers. Can you talk a little bit about structurally what the differences are?
Yeah, police unions are very different from a lot of other public sector unions or private sector unions. The I think the key difference begins with where the power dynamic lies between the workers and the bosses. So police officers are employed by a municipality, and basically, unlike any other type of worker, it's police that are the municipality depends on the police for the protection of property and a certain kind of status quo. So historically, police officers have been the strike force against striking workers in other sectors. They have been the vehicles for maintaining segregation and other types of policies around that politicians in a city would want to perpetuate. So the in the state of Illinois, like in a lot of other places, police officers and firefighters as well actually are prohibited from striking. And so when they sit down to bargain with their employer, which is the city, they both sides know that the strike is not on the table. However, there's other ways that cops can kind of withhold their labor and be non-cooperative to get the kind of contracts they would like from the city. And the city, unlike let's say like a private, steel mill operator or, I don't know, any other type of private business owner or manager, there's limited ways that that kind of withholding of the labor by the police officers can be mitigated. So you can't easily bring in scabs essentially to fill in the gap that's left by striking workers or workers that are withholding their labor in some way. So really what we see time and again, and I'm especially in Chicago, is the municipality is sort of like they're really at the mercy of the union in this sense. And historically, this is why municipalities were so resistant to having police unions, because the kind of view of local officials and also of federal judges that decided over lawsuits over police unionization throughout the 20th century was that police officers really aren't workers like other types of workers. They are a paramilitary organization. And just like the military, they have to have their one allegiance be to their employer, to the state that they serve, and they shouldn't have any other type of, uh, you know, interest involved in this. And so now that police officers are able to unionize, it's really a dynamic in which they're able to get a lot more in their contracts and get a lot more concessions and a lot more bargain from a much stronger position than any other really public or private sector workforce.
Is this where the unions were able to sort of gain enough leverage to develop some of the defaults that are in place now in terms of immunity, or is that actually coming from some other structure?
Yeah, so there's, as far as the again, and I know specifics about the police contracts in Chicago, so really I'm speaking from this place.
Yeah.
But a lot of the very first police union contract that police officers in Chicago had, which came in 1980, really started with its bedrock being the Policeman's Bill of Rights, which was modeled on the kind of First Amendment, Bill of Rights type of protections that developed for criminal suspects and people accused of crimes in the U.S. Constitution in the 20th century. And so as that was happening in the mid-century, police officers who were increasingly accused of misconduct, were increasingly dealing with harsher and harsher discipline from municipalities, they developed this sort of view that the police need a Bill of Rights and they need protections when they're accused of some kind of brutality or misconduct. And so the bedrock of the contract here in Chicago has always been this Bill of Rights that protects officers from having to make statements about their behavior on the job in a certain constraint of time. They're able to know who is accusing them of their crimes. They're able to coordinate with one another before they give statements. They're able to amend their statements after video or audio evidence about the incident becomes available. So really the core of the contract is about protecting officers who are accused of some kind of misconduct. And beyond that, there's a lot of other things like provisions that would require destruction of misconduct records. There's all kinds of stuff, obviously, that's more on the labor side of things, about hours and overtime and vacation and all of that. But basically, yeah, the contract is now extremely elaborate, and it's really much more. There's much more that every time there's something new that's in the contract, which also, of course, depends on the political situation in which the contract is decided. Every time something new is added, it's much more difficult to take it away and to renegotiate the contract. So what we see time after time is, especially throughout the 90s, the contract becomes more elaborate. There's more and more protections and guarantees for officers and less space for the city to come in and really radically change things in order to, change how officers are disciplined, for example.
So in this context, when the defund the police movement, I guess if we call it that, got some momentum a few months ago, one of the things that I said was, I'm unsure that defund is the right approach in all cases, and that there are this is just to give you context for the upcoming discussion. My thought was there are cases where there's too much funding for certain things, like militarization of police. There's other cases where actually being underfunded leads to some of the sort of lower hanging fruit policing that actually causes the problems we're trying to solve. Anyway, my point was, I laid out some ideas that I think would be very useful in actually getting at some of the problems in policing, which include, for example, a national bad actors database to take away the possibility of a police officer leaving one department for bad actions, being hired elsewhere, and the new department saying, we had no idea, there was no way we could have known that's what took place, that this individual had a bad act in their past. Now, the obvious obstacle to that would be every police union would oppose such a database, right? I mean, is it even conceivable that something like that could get past unions?
Yeah, so every police union would oppose that, and also in a lot of places, the contracts do actually provide for the destruction of police misconduct records after a certain amount of years.
Wow.
So even if you wanted to create such a database, in a lot of places, you just couldn't because the records wouldn't even exist anymore. I mean, Illinois is really an exceptional case because we've had a lot of civil rights litigation on this issue. And basically, this past June, actually, the Illinois Supreme Court decided on a case that was started by a independent journalist and civil rights activist, Jamie Calvin. In Calvin versus Chicago, the Illinois Supreme Court decided that the destruction of police misconduct records, which were it turned out that the city wasn't doing it, even though the police union contract said that they were supposed to be destroying them after 5 years. Turned out they weren't doing it. We've got records going back to the 60s. And the Illinois Supreme Court found that actually there's a dead letter provision in the police union contract that these records can't and shouldn't be destroyed because it's a matter of public interest to continue having them. So technically, like in the state of Illinois, you could have some kind of statewide database where, like, if a cop gets fired, which, by the way, is extremely, extremely rare for a cop to even have any kind of discipline based on misconduct allegations or complaints, but in the rare occasions where they are disciplined or fired, you could technically have this kind of database that would prevent them from going across to a different municipality and getting a job there. But I think that one of the other things, and you kind of brought this up with your earlier question about the immunity that officers have, that the kind of immunity from prosecution for their conduct on the job, what's sometimes called qualified immunity or indemnification, that stuff doesn't really stem from the union contracts themselves. Those are provisions that are installed by state law. So it's the state that indemnifies officers against essentially liability for the things they do on the job, which is then why whenever a cop does something bad, it's the city that has to be responsible for that conduct. It's the city that gets sued. It's the city that has to pay. And now the conversation that I'm hearing more and more is about how we should actually require officers to carry liability insurance of some sort for misconduct, sort of like malpractice insurance for doctors, so that they are themselves financially liable for their behavior. And then if they mess up enough times, then nobody's going to want to insure them. And that's how you get these kind of quote unquote bad apples out of the force. Well, that conversation is really dead in the water as long as there are these state laws indemnifying officers. And undoing them would be like a massive, massive battle, especially in a state like Illinois, where, it's very blue up in Chicago, but then the rest of the state is pretty red. It would be hard to get Republican state legislature on board for changing this indemnification thing. But yeah, that's just an additional layer of complication aside from the contract that already provides so many protections for officers.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be balanced in this conversation from the standpoint of, as someone like myself who is on the left, and I am concerned about the state of policing in the United States, I also do recognize that being a police officer is different than working in a factory in a lot of different ways. There is a public responsibility that comes with it. There is an element of, although it's relatively rare for an officer to be killed in the line of duty, statistically speaking, it is a possibility that is more real there than in a number of other jobs. So I think the concern I have is, has the infrastructure, as you're pointing out, fallen out of balance, in the sense that a lot of this stuff that leads to problems is codified in state law, as you're pointing out. There's disproportionate power dynamics. And so I guess what I'm trying to point out to my audience is, I recognize that being a police officer is different than a lot of other jobs. And in some senses, it should be treated differently. But a lot of the infrastructure you're pointing out seems to have fallen a little bit out of balance.
Yeah, there's that. And there's also a third really important piece of this, which is the culture inside police departments. And that is the piece that it's most difficult to kind of tinker with or create interventions to change, because the contract is an expression of a certain kind of culture in the department. The behavior of officers that we see time and time and time again is not just an expression of training. It's not just an expression of the expectations or the rigor or lack thereof of the disciplinary apparatus inside the department. It's also an expression of the culture. And when you have a culture in a police department that, for example, like in Chicago, you have a situation where officers get out of the academy, they get connected with their first field training officers, and routinely the field training officers tell the new recruits, forget everything you learned in the academy, this is how we do this job. And then they teach them illegal kind of techniques that have been found time and again by the Justice Department to be a violation of civil rights. There's a kind of mentality and a culture that gets taught. Oftentimes it's reinforced already because a lot of folks that decide to join the police department grow up in neighborhoods where there's a lot of police neighbors. They may be from police families. It's a kind of intergenerational thing. So personally, I think if we're talking about changing the way that policing operates in this country, it's not just a matter of tinkering with the contract. It's not just a matter of changing the laws in terms of what officers are allowed to do. It's also about addressing culture. How are you going to address a culture in which members of the department are walking around with Punisher skulls on their uniforms? How are you going to address a culture in which members of the department are making racist statements in online forums completely openly? So that kind of stuff, I think, will be probably difficult to change without serious changes in the way that these jobs are paid and how promotion works and how you get ahead in a job like this. And frankly, the more I see of what's going on this summer, the more I think that the kind of culture around weapons and the fact that this is a job that requires you to carry a gun, there's an increasingly, as you point out, militarized component to it. That stuff, I think that if we don't address how police officers are armed and what kind of weaponry young men who might want to join the force or young women who might join the force have access to as part of this job, we're probably not going to see a change in the culture because we're going to keep attracting the same type of people to this job.
Well, as it seems to be a very similar problem to the gun culture problem in the United States, where when we talk about, well, look, in Switzerland, it's this easy to get a firearm, or you can find this other area where everybody has guns and there's no problem. Part of it may be laws, but a lot of it also is the relationship of Americans to firearms, and unless you change that, you're going to have a tough time. But this actually relates to the policing question, which is when there are 350 million firearms out in the United States, and it is true that anybody police come across could have a firearm on them and possibly aren't particularly well trained with it, or whatever the case may be, because it's so easy to get firearms. It seems difficult to deal with the issue of police and firearms without dealing with the issue of 350 million firearms in society.
Right, exactly. And I think that probably as long as we have such a heavily armed general population, and people feel like their only way of being protected, and it's actually true that for some people, their only way of having some kind of sense of protection and security, especially people living in some of the poorest neighborhoods in this country, is having a weapon, because there's interpersonal violence that happens regularly that the police do nothing about, that they do nothing to stop. You're going to have any kind of movement to disarm the police would probably be even more difficult to accomplish its goals than the kind of defund the police movement that we're seeing now. But in general, like, I feel like this whole situation in Kenosha right now, with this young man who, the 17-year-old who shot people, killed people, his whole social media presence was about supporting the police, supporting President Trump, being part of a militia, taking the situation in their own hands. Like, there's a bleed over around a culture of violence and a culture that, like, glorifies weapons and police culture in this country. So we can on the one hand try to tinker around the edges of police contracts and the sort of bureaucracy and infrastructure that exists to perpetuate the system, and on the other hand, like, not address the culture that's already existing in these spaces and allows them to kind of thrive and persist. So it's a complicated thing to untangle, and definitely the thing that's in the power of our local elected officials and municipalities is to not cede so much ground in the police contract negotiations.
All complexly intertwined issues, as you say. Untangling is probably the right phrase to apply to it. We've been speaking with Maya Dukmasova, who's a senior writer at the Chicago Reader. Maya, really appreciate your time today.